In a quiet mountain town surrounded by dense forests and winding roads, Lieutenant Sarah Callahan arrived as part of her military unit's temporary deployment. The town was small, with weathered buildings and narrow streets that seemed frozen in time. It wasn't the kind of place where outsiders were welcomed easily, especially soldiers in uniform. But Sarah wasn't just any soldier. She was one of the best K-9 handlers in the military, known for her bond with her dogs and her ability to handle even the toughest situations. Sarah had spent years training alongside some of the most disciplined and intelligent working dogs in the world. Her two companions on this mission were Titan and Echo, both German shepherds bred specifically for their strength, speed, and sharp instincts. Together, they had completed countless missions, from search and rescue operations to high-stakes security details. Yet this assignment felt different. Instead of combat zones or secret operations, Sarah found herself navigating the complexities of civilian life in a community that didn't seem eager to trust her. The locals kept their distance at first, watching Sarah and her team with wary eyes. Some whispered behind closed doors about how the presence of the military would disrupt their peaceful routines. Others simply avoided interaction altogether, crossing the street when they saw uniforms approaching. But there was one group in particular that made its feelings crystal clear: the bikers. They called themselves the Iron Riders, a rough-and-tumble gang notorious for ruling the town with loud motorcycles, leather jackets adorned with patches, and a reputation for trouble. Their leader, a towering man named Razor, was the loudest and proudest of them all. With his long beard, tattoos covering every visible inch of skin, and an attitude that screamed defiance, he wasn't someone you'd want to cross paths with unless absolutely necessary. On her second day in town, Sarah decided it was important to get familiar with the area. Taking Titan and Echo out for a walk, she hoped the exercise would help them adjust to the new environment. As they strolled down the main street, the sound of roaring engines filled the air. Within moments, a pack of motorcycles roared into view, circling around her like predators sizing up their prey. At the center of the chaos was Razor, smirking as he brought his bike to a stop right in front of her. Well, what do we have here?" Razor sneered, leaning back on his seat as if he owned the road. His voice carried a mocking tone that immediately set Sarah's nerves on edge. "Look at you, little soldier girl, parading your mutts around like you're hot stuff." His words drew laughter from the other bikers, who revved their engines louder, creating a deafening racket. Sarah clenched her fists but forced herself to stay calm. She knew better than to let insults rattle her, especially in front of people who thrived on intimidation. Still, the weight of their jeers pressed down on her shoulders. They weren't just mocking her. They were testing her, trying to see if she'd crack under pressure. Titan and Echo, sensing her tension, stood closer to her side, their bodies tense and alert. Though trained not to react without command, their protective instincts were undeniable. To anyone paying attention, it was obvious these dogs weren't ordinary pets. They were highly skilled professionals capable of incredible feats. But to the bikers, they were nothing more than props in their game of mockery. As the confrontation dragged on, Sarah realized this wouldn't be an easy assignment. These men weren't just rowdy locals. They were a force to be reckoned with. And while she had faced danger before, this situation required a different kind of strategy. One that balanced patience, confidence, and a willingness to prove herself in unexpected ways. Little did she know, the real challenge was only beginning. The encounter with the bikers left a bitter taste in Sarah's mouth, but she refused to let it consume her. She had faced tougher situations before, and this was no different. At least, that's what she told herself as she walked back to the military outpost with Titan and Euro trotting loyally by her side. The dogs seemed to sense her unease. Their ears were perked up, and they occasionally glanced at her with concerned eyes, as if asking if everything was okay. Sarah gave them a reassuring pat on their heads, murmuring softly to let them know they'd done nothing wrong. Still, the sting of Razor's words lingered. Word traveled fast in the small town. And it wasn't long before the story of Sarah's run-in with the bikers became the talk of the day. Some locals whispered sympathetically about how brave she was for standing her ground, while others laughed along with the bikers' mockery, seeing it as another example of outsiders being out of place. By evening, the entire town seemed to know about the military girl who thought she could walk through their streets unbothered. It didn't help that the bikers made sure to spread their version of events far and wide, exaggerating their insults and painting Sarah as weak and foolish. Sarah tried to focus on her duties, reminding herself why she was there in the first place. Her mission wasn't about winning over the townsfolk or proving anything to the bikers. It was about maintaining peace and ensuring safety during her unit's deployment. But ignoring the growing tension wasn't easy. Every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes watching her. Some stares were curious, others hostile, but all of them carried judgment. Even simple tasks like grabbing supplies from the local store felt like walking into enemy territory. People would pause mid-conversation when she entered, resuming only after she left, their hushed tones following her out the door. One afternoon, as Sarah practiced obedience drills with Titan and Echo near the edge of town, she noticed a group of children peeking at her from behind a fence. They looked fascinated by the dogs, giggling and pointing whenever Titan performed a perfect heel or Echo executed a sharp turn. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to smile, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe not everyone here was against her. Encouraged, she waved the kids over, inviting them to watch the training session up close. Their laughter brightened the otherwise gloomy atmosphere, and for a brief period, the weight on her shoulders lifted. But the reprieve was short-lived. As the sun began to set, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines signaled trouble once again. This time, the bikers pulled up closer, surrounding her makeshift training area. Razor led the pack, his smug grin widening as he revved his engine. "Hey, soldier girl," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You still playing fetch with your puppies? Thought maybe you'd learned your lesson by now." His gang erupted in laughter, their loud voices echoing across the field. Sarah clenched her jaw, but kept her composure. She knew better than to rise to the bait, especially with children nearby. Instead, she calmly ordered Titan and Echo to sit, their disciplined posture a stark contrast to the chaos around them. The kids gasped in awe, clearly impressed by the dog's behavior. Even some of the bikers paused for a second, momentarily taken aback by the sight of such control and precision. Razor, however, wasn't about to back down. He leaned forward on his bike, narrowing the gap between him and Sarah. "You think those fancy tricks make you tough?" He sneered, gesturing toward Titan and Echo. "They're just animals. What are they gonna do? Bark at us?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, her expression calm but firm. "They don't need to bark to get their point across," she replied evenly, her voice cutting through the noise. "And neither do I." Her response silenced the bikers for a beat, though Razor quickly recovered, scoffing loudly to cover his momentary hesitation. He motioned for his crew to leave, but not before tossing one final insult over his shoulder. "We'll see how tough you really are," he growled, his tone laced with thinly veiled anger. As the motorcycles disappeared into the distance, Sarah exhaled slowly, her heart pounding despite her outward calm. She turned to Titan and Echo, who sat patiently beside her, waiting for her next command. "Good job, boys," she said softly, scratching behind their ears. Though the confrontation was over, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Razor's parting words lingered in her mind, a promise of more challenges to come. The days that followed were far from easy for Sarah. The bikers' mockery didn't stop after their initial encounter. It only grew louder and more persistent. Razor and his gang made it a point to ride past her whenever she ventured into town, revving their engines and shouting taunts that echoed through the streets. Their jeers ranged from sarcastic comments about her uniform to outright insults about her dogs, calling them overgrown house pets and questioning whether they could actually do anything besides look intimidating. To make matters worse, Their antics seemed to embolden others in the town who weren't fond of the military presence. Whispers and snickers followed Sarah wherever she went, making her feel like an outsider in every sense of the word. Despite the hostility, Sarah refused to let it break her focus. She knew her primary goal was to maintain peace and ensure the safety of both her unit and the townspeople during their deployment. But staying calm wasn't as simple as it sounded. Every time she heard the roar of motorcycles or caught sight of leather jackets out of the corner of her eye, her nerves tightened. Titan and Echo noticed too. Their ears would perk up, and their bodies tensed as if ready to spring into action at her command. Still, Sarah kept them grounded, reminding herself, and them, that reacting impulsively would only escalate the situation. One evening, as Sarah sat on the steps outside the military outpost, she overheard fragments of conversation drifting from a nearby diner. A group of locals had gathered there, swapping stories and gossiping about recent events. Among them were the bikers, their loud voices carrying clearly even from a distance. Razor's deep laugh cut through the chatter as he recounted their earlier run-ins with Sarah, embellishing the details to make her seem even more foolish. "She thinks she's something special with those mutts," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "But we'll see how tough she really is when push comes to shove." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to block out the sound, but her curiosity got the better of her. She leaned slightly forward, straining to hear more. One of the bikers chimed in, bragging about how they planned to teach the military puppets a lesson if they ever dared to step foot near their clubhouse. The rest of the group cheered in agreement, their laughter ringing out like a challenge. Though Sarah couldn't see their faces, she could picture the smug expressions they wore, fueled by bravado and arrogance. Titan rested his head on her knee, his warm eyes meeting hers as if to ask what was wrong. Sarah gave him a gentle pat, forcing a small smile despite the unease bubbling inside her. She knew better than to take their threats lightly, even if they were mostly hot air. Razor's gang might have been all talk, but Sarah had learned from experience that underestimating opponents, no matter how reckless or unorganized, was a mistake. These men weren't just bullies, they were troublemakers with a reputation for causing chaos, and crossing paths with them again was inevitable. Later that night, Sarah found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that Razor's words carried more weight than he intended. His gang's territorial behavior suggested they had something to hide, and their aggressive posturing hinted at deeper involvement in illegal activities. Was this just about pride, or was there something else driving their animosity? Whatever the case, Sarah realized she needed to tread carefully. Pushing back too hard might provoke them further, while ignoring them altogether risked losing respect, not just from the bikers, but from the townspeople who were watching closely. As dawn broke the next morning, Sarah stepped outside with Titan and Echo by her side, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Her resolve hardened with each passing day. If Razor and his crew wanted to test her strength, she was prepared to show them exactly what she and her dogs were capable of, but not on their terms. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity and earning the trust of a community that desperately needed stability. And Sarah knew that sometimes the best way to win a battle wasn't through force. It was through patience, strategy, and unwavering confidence. Sarah knew she couldn't face Razor and his gang alone. While her dogs were incredibly skilled, relying solely on their abilities wouldn't be enough to win over the townspeople or put an end to the bikers' provocations. She needed a plan, and more importantly, she needed allies. Sitting in the small briefing room at the outpost, she pored over maps of the town, studying every street, alleyway, and landmark. Captain Hayes, her commanding officer, noticed her frustration and approached her with a calm demeanor. "You're doing everything right, Lieutenant," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But remember, respect isn't given, it's earned. Sometimes, you have to show people what you're made of before they'll believe in you." His words resonated with Sarah, but she also knew that earning respect required more than just proving herself. It meant understanding the dynamics of the town and finding someone who could help bridge the gap between her unit and the locals. That's when fate stepped in, literally in the form of a flat tire. Later that afternoon, as Sarah drove back from a routine patrol, one of her vehicle's tires blew out near a mechanic's shop on the outskirts of town. Cursing under her breath, she pulled over and stepped out to assess the damage. Before she could grab the spare tire from the trunk, a voice called out from behind her, "Need a hand?" Turning around, Sarah saw a young woman wiping grease-stained hands on a rag. Her name was Mia, the owner of the mechanic shop, and she had a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put Sarah at ease. With short, curly hair and a confident stride, Mia exuded strength and independence. As she worked on replacing the tire, the two women struck up a conversation. At first, it was casual, talk about the weather, the condition of the roads, and how often flat tires happened in this part of town. But soon, Mia began opening up. "I've seen those bikers messing with you," Maya said bluntly, tightening the lug nuts with precision. "They think they run this place, but trust me, nobody likes them. They're nothing but trouble." Sarah hesitated for a moment before responding. "I don't want to cause any problems. I'm here to do my job and keep things peaceful." Mia chuckled dryly. "Peaceful? Around here? Good luck with that. Those guys aren't just bullies. They're criminals. Drugs, stolen goods, illegal racing, you name it. They've probably done it. But they pick their fights carefully. If you stand up to them, they'll back off eventually." The information was invaluable. For the first time since arriving in town, Sarah felt like she had someone on her side. Mia offered to keep an eye on the bikers' movements and let Sarah know if anything suspicious came up. In return, Sarah promised to stay vigilant and avoid unnecessary confrontations. The unlikely alliance gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few days, Sarah began preparing for the inevitable showdown. She spent hours training with Titan and Echo, fine-tuning their skills and rehearsing scenarios that might arise if the bikers decided to escalate their antics. The dogs responded beautifully, executing commands with flawless precision. Their teamwork was so seamless that watching them move together felt almost poetic, a dance of loyalty and discipline. Meanwhile, Sarah started paying closer attention to the townspeople. She made an effort to engage with them, asking questions about the history of the town and sharing stories about her own experiences as a K-9 handler. Slowly but surely, some of the hostility began to fade. A few shopkeepers greeted her warmly when she passed by, and even the children who had watched her train the dogs earlier became regular visitors, eager to learn more about Titan and Echo. One evening, as Sarah walked through the quieter parts of town with her dogs, she spotted Mia working late at the garage. Pulling over, she thanked her again for the advice and support. Mia smiled faintly, leaning against the hood of a car. "Just don't let those idiots get under your skin," she said firmly. "Show them you're not afraid, but don't give them a reason to come after you either. Let your dogs do the talking if it comes to that." Sarah nodded, feeling the surge of determination. She didn't know when or where the next confrontation would happen, but she was ready. With Mia's guidance, her team's backing, and the unwavering loyalty of Titan and Echo, she had everything she needed to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. This wasn't just about teaching the bikers a lesson anymore. It was about showing the entire town that she was someone worth trusting, and Sarah intended to prove it in a way that no one would forget. It was a crisp afternoon when Sarah decided to take Titan and Echo for another walk through the heart of town. Word had spread about her growing presence, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Some people admired her calm demeanor despite the bikers' constant taunts, while others remained skeptical, unsure if she truly had what it took to handle herself or her dogs against Razor's gang. Unbeknownst to Sarah, the bikers had been watching her movements closely, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As she strolled down the main street, the familiar roar of motorcycle engines filled the air. Within moments, Razor and his crew surrounded her, their bikes kicking up dust as they came to a stop in a loose circle. The townsfolk paused whatever they were doing, gathering at a safe distance to watch the scene unfold. It was clear that Razor wasn't just here to mock her this time. He wanted to make a spectacle out of it. Well, Razor sneered, leaning back on his bike with an exaggerated grin. Look who decided to show her face again. Thought maybe you'd learned your lesson after last time. Sarah stopped walking, her expression calm but alert. Titan and Echo stood firmly by her side, their bodies tense but controlled. She didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch until Razor grew impatient. "Come on, soldier girl," he barked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think those fancy mutts of yours can actually do anything, or are they just for show?" The crowd murmured, some chuckling nervously while others exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah knew this was her chance to turn the tables, to prove not just to Razor but to everyone watching that she and her dogs weren't to be underestimated. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward slightly, meeting Razor's gaze head-on. "If you're so curious," she said evenly, her voice carrying over the hum of idling engines, "why don't we put them to the test?" Razor raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by her boldness. "What did you say?" "A challenge," Sarah continued, her tone steady and confident. "Let my dogs prove what they're capable of. If they succeed, you leave us, and the townspeople, alone. No more harassment, no more threats." The crowd gasped audibly, surprised by her daring proposal. Razor hesitated, his smug grin faltering for a split second before returning with even more arrogance. "Fine," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "But don't come crying when your little pets embarrass you." Sarah nodded, unfazed. "Here's how it works. Hide something small, a keychain, a wallet, anything, and give my dogs 5 minutes to find it. If they locate it, you admit defeat in front of everyone. Deal?" Razor laughed loudly, glancing at his gang for approval. They hooted and hollered, clearly convinced that Sarah was setting herself up for failure. After a theatrical pause, Razor agreed. "All right, soldier girl, let's see what your pups can do." With that, one of the bikers pulled a shiny keychain from his pocket and disappeared into a nearby alley cluttered with crates, barrels, and discarded furniture. He tossed the item somewhere deep within the mess, ensuring it would be nearly impossible to spot without careful searching. When he returned, the gang revved their engines triumphantly, certain they had rigged the game in their favor. Sarah knelt beside Titan and Echo, speaking softly as she gave them their instructions. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see what would happen next. Even Razor leaned forward slightly, his confidence wavering for the first time. Sarah rose to her feet and signaled for the dogs to begin. Titan took the lead, his nose scanning the ground methodically as Echo flanked him, covering more ground with swift precision. The two dogs moved like a single unit, communicating silently through subtle gestures and instinctual teamwork. Every movement was deliberate, every sniff calculated. Within seconds, Titan froze, his tail wagging slightly as he locked onto a scent. Echo joined him, circling a stack of crates before nudging one gently aside. And there it was, the keychain, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Titan picked it up carefully in his mouth and trotted back to Sarah, dropping it into her open palm. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Even some of the bikers looked impressed, though Razor quickly masked his shock with a scowl. "You got lucky," he muttered, refusing to meet her eyes. But Sarah simply smiled, knowing this was only the beginning. The crowd's applause echoed through the streets, but Sarah wasn't finished yet. She knew that finding the keychain had silenced some of Razor's mockery, but it wasn't enough to make him, or anyone else, truly respect her and her dogs. Razor's scowl deepened as he muttered under his breath, clearly unwilling to admit defeat. "Beginner's luck," he sneered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Your mutts got lucky once. Big deal." Sarah didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she calmly knelt beside Titan and Echo, giving them a few quiet words of praise. The dogs wagged their tails, their eyes bright with pride, but they remained focused, ready for whatever came next. Rising to her feet, Sarah turned to face Razor, her expression unshaken. "If you think that was just luck," she said, her voice steady and clear, "then let me show you what else they can do." Without waiting for his response, she stepped back and signaled for the dogs to perform their advanced maneuvers. First, she pointed to a tall wooden fence at the edge of the alley. "Titan, scale," she commanded. In one fluid motion, Titan sprinted forward, launching himself upward with powerful strides. His claws gripped the rough surface as he climbed effortlessly, reaching the top in seconds. Once there, he balanced perfectly, scanning the area below with sharp focus. The crowd gasped in awe, their skepticism melting into admiration. Next, Sarah gestured toward a practice dummy propped against a wall, a makeshift stand-in for potential threats. "Echo, disarm," she called out. Echo sprang into action, moving with lightning speed. He circled the dummy, assessing its position before leaping onto it with precision. With a single well-placed paw, he knocked the object over, sending it crashing to the ground. The townspeople cheered again, clapping enthusiastically as Echo returned to Sarah's side, his tail held high. But Sarah wasn't done. She wanted to leave no room for doubt. Turning to a narrow beam stretched between two crates, she gave her final command. "Both of you, balance and retrieve." Titan and Echo exchanged a glance, their teamwork seamless as always. Titan went first, walking confidently along the beam despite its wobbling instability. Halfway across, he paused, allowing Echo to join him. Together, they navigated the narrow path, their movements synchronized as if choreographed. At the end of the beam sat a small toy, a challenge Sarah had discreetly placed earlier. Titan gently picked it up and carried it back to her, his jaw holding it delicately so as not to damage it. By the time the demonstration ended, even the most skeptical onlookers were won over. Gasps turned into cheers, and whispers of disbelief transformed into murmurs of respect. The bikers, however, weren't ready to concede. Razor clenched his fists, his face reddening with frustration. He barked at his gang to rev their engines louder, trying to drown out the applause, but it was futile. The crowd's attention was firmly fixed on Sarah and her incredible dogs. Finally, Razor snapped. Pushing through the gathering, he stormed up to Sarah, his towering frame looming over her. For a moment, tension crackled in the air. The townsfolk fell silent, unsure of what would happen next. But instead of yelling or threatening her, Razor simply spat out, "This isn't over. You think your tricks impress us? Fine, but don't expect this to change anything." Sarah met his glare without flinching. "It's not about impressing anyone," she replied coolly. "It's about proving that I, and my team, deserve respect. And if you have a problem with that, maybe it's time you rethink who you're picking fights with." Her words hung in the air, silencing Razor completely. Behind him, his gang shifted uncomfortably, their bravado fading under the weight of the crowd's disapproval. For the first time since arriving in town, Sarah felt a shift, not just in the atmosphere, but in the way people looked at her. No longer was she an outsider to be mocked. She was someone to be reckoned with. As Razor stalked away, muttering curses under his breath, the townsfolk began dispersing, many stopping to congratulate Sarah on her dog's performance. Even some of the children ran up to pet Titan and Echo, their earlier fear replaced by fascination. Sarah smiled warmly, letting them interact with her loyal companions while keeping a watchful eye on the retreating bikers. Though the confrontation had ended, Sarah knew this victory was only temporary. Razor wasn't the kind of man to back down easily, and she suspected he'd find another way to test her resolve. But for now, she allowed herself a small sense of triumph. The lesson had been taught, not just to Razor and his gang, but to everyone watching. True strength wasn't about intimidation or arrogance. It was about skill, discipline, and the unwavering bond between handler and dog. and Sarah had proven she had all three in spades. The victory in the alleyway had been sweet, but Sarah knew better than to let her guard down. Razor's gang wasn't the type to back off after a single defeat, no matter how public or humiliating it might have been. She could feel their eyes on her in the days that followed, watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. The tension in the town remained thick, like storm clouds hovering just above the horizon, ready to burst at any moment. One evening, as Sarah returned from a routine patrol with Titan and Echo, she noticed something unusual. The streets were eerily quiet, even for a small town like this one. Normally, there would be at least a few people lingering outside, shopkeepers closing up for the night, children playing near their homes, or locals chatting on porches. But tonight, the only sound came from the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. It didn't take long for Sarah to realize what was happening. Razor and his gang were following her. She kept walking, her pace steady and deliberate, refusing to show any sign of fear. Titan and Echo, ever vigilant, stayed close to her sides, their ears perked and muscles taut, ready for whatever might come next. As they approached the edge of town, the bikers finally made their move. 4 motorcycles roared into view, surrounding Sarah and cutting off her path forward. Razor led the pack, his face twisted with anger and embarrassment. "You think your little show the other day made you untouchable," he growled, revving his engine menacingly. "We're not done yet." Sarah stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding but her expression calm. She glanced around, assessing the situation. There was no one else in sight, no townsfolk to witness what was about to happen. This wasn't about teaching her a lesson anymore. It was personal now. Razor wanted revenge, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. "Whatever you're planning," Sarah said evenly, her voice cutting through the noise, "you'll regret it." Razor laughed bitterly, motioning for his gang to spread out. They circled her slowly, creating a tight perimeter. Their engines drowned out all other sounds, filling the air with a deafening roar. For a moment, Sarah wondered if she'd pushed too far, if she'd underestimated just how dangerous these men could be. But then she felt the reassuring presence of Titan and Echo beside her. Her dogs weren't afraid, and neither was she. Without warning, Razor dismounted his bike and took a step toward her. His hand hovered near his belt, where a large knife hung ominously. "You wanna play tough? Fine. Let's see how tough you really are." Before he could take another step, Titan let out a low, guttural growl that sent chills down everyone's spines. His lips curled back slightly, revealing sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. Echo mirrored his stance, standing rigid and alert, her piercing gaze locked onto Razor. The message was clear: one wrong move, and things would escalate quickly. For the first time since their encounter began, Razor hesitated. He glanced at his gang, who had fallen silent, their bravado fading under the weight of the dog's intimidating presence. Even hardened criminals like them understood when they were outmatched. Slowly, Razor lowered his hand, stepping back toward his bike. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. With a sharp whistle, he signaled for his gang to retreat. The motorcycles roared to life again, kicking up dust as they sped away into the night. As the sound of engines faded into the distance, Sarah exhaled deeply, her body relaxing slightly. Titan and Echo stayed by her side, their protective instincts still on high alert. Though the immediate threat had passed, Sarah knew Razor wouldn't give up easily. But tonight, she had proven something important, not just to him, but to herself. She didn't need to rely on brute force or intimidation to win. Her strength lay in her composure, her skills, and the unbreakable bond she shared with her dogs. Word of the confrontation spread quickly among the townspeople. By morning, everyone knew how Sarah and her dogs had stood their ground against Razor and his gang. Some cheered openly, while others simply nodded in quiet respect. The once hostile stares turned into nods of acknowledgement, and even the shopkeepers who had avoided her before now greeted her warmly. Though the battle wasn't fully won, Sarah felt a shift in the air. The bikers kept their distance, no longer daring to harass her or anyone else associated with the military. And for the first time since arriving in town, Sarah felt like she truly belonged, not because she sought approval, but because she had earned it. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah noticed a profound change in the town. The once hostile atmosphere had softened, replaced by a quiet respect that rippled through the community. The bikers, though still present, no longer strutted around with their usual arrogance. Razor and his gang avoided crossing paths with Sarah altogether, their loud engines conspicuously absent from the streets she frequented. Even when they did appear, they kept their distance, their earlier bravado replaced by wary glances. It was clear that Titan and Echo's demonstration, and the standoff that followed, had left an indelible mark on them. The townsfolk, too, began treating Sarah differently. Shopkeepers who had once ignored her now greeted her warmly, sometimes even offering discounts or small tokens of gratitude. Children ran up to her eagerly whenever they saw her walking with Titan and Echo, their laughter filling the air as they begged to pet the dogs. Sarah always obliged, kneeling down to let them interact with her loyal companions while sharing stories about their training and missions. These moments became a highlight of her days, reminding her why she had chosen this path in the first place: to serve, protect, and connect with people in meaningful ways. Even Mia, the mechanic who had become an unexpected ally, seemed to warm up to Sarah over time. One afternoon, as Sarah stopped by the garage to thank her for keeping an eye on the bikers, Mia handed her a freshly repaired tire with a grin. "You've done more for this town than anyone gives you credit for," she said simply. "Those bikers might act tough, but they're scared of you now. And so is everyone else who thought they could push you around." Sarah smiled, touched by the sentiment. "It wasn't just me," she replied, glancing at Titan and Echo, who were lounging nearby. "These two deserve most of the credit." Mia chuckled, shaking her head. "Maybe, but it takes someone special to earn that kind of loyalty from animals like them. You've earned ours too, soldier girl." The bond between Sarah and the townspeople continued to grow stronger with each passing day. She made it a point to attend local events, a farmer's market here, a charity fundraiser there, always bringing Titan and Echo along. Their presence never failed to draw crowds, and soon enough, the dogs became local legends. Stories of their incredible skills spread far beyond the town limits, inspiring admiration and curiosity wherever they went. When the time came for Sarah's deployment to end, there was a bittersweet feeling in the air. On her final morning in town, a group of residents gathered outside the military outpost to see her off. Some brought homemade gifts, jars of jam, hand-knitted scarves, and even a painting of Titan and Echo in action. Others simply stood quietly, nodding their heads in gratitude. The children, clutching drawings of the dogs, hugged Sarah tightly before running back to their parents. As Sarah loaded her gear into the truck, she took one last look at the town she had come to care for deeply. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was better than when she had arrived. The tension between the townsfolk and the military had eased, and the bikers no longer ruled the streets with fear. In its place was a fragile but growing sense of unity, built on mutual respect and understanding. Titan and Echo sat patiently beside her, their tails wagging gently as if sensing the significance of the moment. Sarah knelt down to give them a final scratch behind the ears. "You did good, boys," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Real good." With a wave and a smile, Sarah climbed into the truck and started the engine. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror to see the townspeople waving goodbye, their faces etched with smiles. Among them was Mia, leaning against her garage door, giving her a thumbs up. For a brief moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel proud, not just of what she had accomplished, but of how much she had grown during her time in the town. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. True strength wasn't about dominance or intimidation. It was about resilience, compassion, and the ability to inspire others to see the best in themselves. And as she looked at Titan and Echo sitting proudly beside her, she realized that the lessons she had taught them were the same ones they had taught her in return.